At exactly 6:00 a.m. on the day we were supposed to fly to the coast, I woke up to a house that was entirely too quiet. For 2 years, my son David and his wife Sarah had lived in my lower level. Mornings usually meant the heavy thud of David's work boots on the stairs and Sarah loudly complaining about the internet speed. Today, there was absolutely nothing. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. The driveway was completely empty. David's truck and the large SUV they had rented for our family vacation were gone. Today was the start of a 10-day coastal retreat. I had spent months organizing it and paid exactly $10,500 out of my own savings to make it happen. I walked downstairs to the kitchen. A half-empty coffee pot sat on the counter, still warm to the touch. Beside it, a crumpled printout of the resort itinerary caught my eye. I smoothed it out against the granite counter. Master Suite, David and Sarah. Guest room, Sarah's parents. Bunk room, the kids. My name wasn't anywhere on the paper. They hadn't accidentally forgotten to wake me up. They had planned a trip using my money and purposely designed it to leave me behind. I picked up my phone and dialed David's number. He answered over the dull hum of highway tires. "Mom, David, where are you?" He hesitated, a heavy pause that told me everything. We're on the road. Sarah's parents wanted to leave early, and the kids were fussy. We figured it would just be easier to get a head start. Easier to leave without the person who paid for the trip. I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. David sighed, the sound of a man who always chose the path of least resistance. "We thought you wouldn't mind having the house to yourself to just relax." I looked down at the crumpled itinerary. "I see," I replied. "Enjoy the trip, David." I ended the call. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. Instead, I walked into my office, opened my laptop, and logged into the resort's portal. I found the $10,500 reservation. With 2 quiet clicks, I canceled the entire week. The refund receipt appeared in my inbox seconds later. They wanted a vacation without me. I was happy to give it to them. The quiet in the house felt different now. It wasn't the lonely silence of a widow, but the crisp, clean air of someone who had just opened a stale window. David and Sarah were supposed to stay with me for 6 months to save for a down payment. 6 months turned into 2 full years. In that time, Sarah had slowly colonized my home. My antique dining chairs were pushed into the garage because they didn't match her aesthetic. My grocery bills had tripled to accommodate her strict organic diets. David just kept his head down, asking me to keep the peace whenever I brought it up. I walked downstairs to their living area. Clothes were strewn across the sofa. Wet towels rested on my hardwood floors, ruining the finish. I wasn't angry. Anger requires too much energy. I was simply done. I walked out to the garage and pulled out a stack of sturdy moving boxes. I started with the bathroom. I neatly packed Sarah's expensive skincare products, most of which I had paid for using my emergency credit card. Then I moved to the living room, boxing up the gaming console David played when he was supposed to be working extra shifts. I didn't rush. I folded their clothes carefully. I didn't break a single item. I just systematically erased their presence from my primary living spaces. By noon, 15 boxes sat neatly stacked in the center of the garage. Next, I opened my phone's smart home application. I deleted David's thumbprint from the front door lock. I erased Sarah's access code. I reset the garage keypad to a brand new number. It wasn't a punishment, it was a physical boundary. If I wasn't family enough to join the vacation I financed, I was no longer a free hotel. I made myself a simple sandwich, enjoying my lunch in total silence. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was 2:15 p.m. They should have been arriving at the resort lobby right about now. I looked at the screen, saw David's name, and let it ring. The phone rang 4 times before stopping. A minute later, it started again, followed by 3 rapid text messages. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, sat at the kitchen island, and finally pressed accept on the 5th call. "Mom!" David's voice pitched high with panic. "Did you block your credit card? The resort is saying the reservation doesn't exist." In the background, I could hear Sarah shouting at a receptionist, her voice echoing through the busy lobby. "My card is working perfectly fine, David," I replied, taking a slow sip of my tea. "Then why won't they give us our keys? They're telling us the whole booking was canceled this morning." It was. "What?" The background noise seemed to drop as David stopped walking. "Why would you do that?" I looked at the crumpled itinerary I had pinned to the refrigerator. "Because I read the room assignments you left in the trash. There was no room for me." Sarah's parents were taking the guest suite. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. He knew. Of course he knew. Mom, Sarah's parents just needed a break and things got complicated. "It's not complicated at all," I corrected him. "You wanted a free trip. You didn't want me there, so you don't have a free trip." "You're leaving us stranded," he demanded, his voice cracking. "There are 6 of us here." "You're adults. You both have jobs. You can book rooms." Sarah's voice suddenly pierced the speaker, sharp and demanding. "Give me the phone. Marjorie, fix this right now. My parents are exhausted." "Then they should find a place to sit down," I answered simply. "This is incredibly selfish," Sarah snapped. "Selfish is sneaking out of the house at dawn to steal a $10,000 vacation," I replied calmly. "You wanted independence, Sarah. Now you have it." I hung up the phone. I didn't wait for the barrage of angry texts. I turned the device on silent, placed it face down on the counter, and walked outside to tend to my garden. The afternoon sun felt wonderful on my shoulders. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at my desk, going through my finances. For 2 years, I had ignored the small, creeping charges. A subscription service here, a premium grocery delivery fee there. It was time to clean house. I logged into my bank accounts. First, I navigated to my emergency credit card. I clicked on the Authorized Users tab and removed David's name. He had used that exact card to rent the large SUV they drove away in that morning. Without my authorization, the card would decline the next time he tried to swipe it for gas or food. Next, I logged into my internet provider. I changed the Wi-Fi password. I systematically logged into the premium streaming services I paid for and forced a sign-out on all devices. Sarah loved watching her reality shows on my dime. Tonight, she would have to find another way. It felt like pruning dead branches off a healthy tree. Around 6:00 p.m., an email popped up on my laptop screen from David. "We had to pay $900 for 2 cheap motel rooms. Sarah is furious. We are driving back tomorrow morning. We need to talk." I read the message, deleted it, and closed the laptop. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I walked to the kitchen and ordered a pizza with extra garlic. Something Sarah always complained made the house smell terrible. I ate it in the living room and watched a classic movie at a volume I actually enjoyed. The house was completely mine again. No heavy footsteps overhead, no passive-aggressive sighs when I walked into my own kitchen. I slept better that night than I had in 24 months. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, grounded, and entirely prepared. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and sat by the front window. At 9:15 a.m., the rented SUV pulled into the driveway, followed closely by David's truck. The doors flew open. The real test was about to begin. I stood quietly in the hallway as Sarah stormed up the front walkway, her face flushed red with anger. David trailed a few steps behind her, looking hollow and exhausted. Sarah's parents wisely remained inside their vehicle. I watched through the narrow side windows as Sarah marched onto the porch. She reached for the smart lock keypad and quickly punched in her 4-digit code. A red light flashed. She huffed, muttered under her breath, and hit the numbers much harder. Red again. "Are you kidding me?" she hissed, pressing her thumb against the biometric scanner. Nothing happened. David walked up the steps, pulling his keychain from his pocket. He inserted his physical key into the deadbolt and turned it. The heavy wooden door swung open, but the thick metal security screen remained firmly locked from the inside. I stepped into view, holding my mug of coffee. "Good morning," I greeted them. Sarah glared through the metal screen, her hands resting on her hips. "Open the door, Marjorie. I am not in the mood for your games." "Neither am I," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. David stepped forward, his shoulders slumped. "Mom, please. We drove half the night. We're exhausted. Just let us in." "I packed your essentials," I told him, pointing a finger toward the closed garage door. "The new keypad code is 4421. You'll find your clothes, Sarah's electronics, and your toiletries neatly boxed up." Sarah's jaw dropped. She gripped the handle of the screen door, shaking it violently. "You touched my things. You packed our stuff." "I protected my property," I corrected her. "You made it entirely clear I am not part of your family. Therefore, you are no longer residents in my home." "We live here," David protested, his voice raising in desperation. "You stayed here," I countered smoothly. "Rent-free to save money. But you didn't save anything, did you, David? You spent it on organic groceries and secret vacations." "You can't do this," Sarah yelled. I looked her directly in the eye. "You have the right to collect your boxes from the garage. You do not have the right to enter my house." David looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. In a way, I was. He was used to the mother who smiled through the disrespect, the one who swallowed her pride to keep the peace at the dinner table. He was not used to a woman with a locked door and a steady voice. "Mom, where are we supposed to go?" he asked quietly, the fight draining out of him. "That is something you should have considered yesterday morning before you drove away," I answered. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it through the narrow mail slot on the security door. It fluttered onto the porch mat. David slowly bent down and picked it up. "If you want to stay in the lower level for the next 30 days while you secure an apartment, those are the terms," I explained. David unfolded the paper and read it aloud. "Rent is $1,500 a month payable today. You pay half the utilities. No guests whatsoever, including Sarah's parents." Sarah snatched the paper out of his hands, her eyes scanning the neat print. $1,500. "We're family. You own this house outright." "Exactly." I smiled faintly. "I own it. And family doesn't sneak off with a $10,000 vacation while the host sleeps upstairs." "We don't have $1,500 right now," Sarah yelled, crumpling the paper in her fist. "Then you don't have a place to stay," I said simply. "You both make a good income. If you have no savings after 2 years of free housing, you have a massive spending problem, not a housing problem." "David, tell her she's being insane." Sarah turned to her husband, expecting him to leap to her defense as he always did. David looked at the crumpled paper in her hand, then looked at me. For the first time in his marriage, he didn't immediately side with her. He looked at the locked screen door, the changed codes, and the unyielding reality of my boundaries. "She's not being insane, Sarah," David whispered. "She's dead serious." Sarah whipped her head toward David, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you taking her side after she literally ruined our Christmas trip?" "She didn't ruin it," David said, his voice barely audible. "We tried to take it without her. We lied to her." I watched my son. There was a flicker of accountability there, buried deep under years of passivity. He was finally seeing the consequence of his silence. "David, I said clearly, cutting through the tension on the porch. You used my emergency credit card to rent that SUV sitting in my driveway. That was not an emergency. You owe me $200 for the rental by this Friday, or I will dispute the charge with the bank as unauthorized. Sarah scoffed loudly, throwing her hands in the air. You wouldn't dare do that to your own son. I met her gaze directly, my expression completely flat. Try me. Sarah crossed her arms, her face twisting in defiance. She realized her usual tactics of guilt and volume were useless against a locked door. Fine. We're leaving. I am not paying a single dime to live in a basement with a dictator. She expected David to argue, to beg me to relent, to promise he would fix everything. Instead, David just nodded slowly. Okay, he said. He turned away from the door and walked down the porch steps, heading straight toward the garage keypad. Sarah stared at his back, completely bewildered. David, what are you doing? I'm getting our boxes, he answered without turning around. He punched in the new code and the garage door slowly began to rise. I watched Sarah stomp down the steps, marching toward her parents' car to loudly complain through the open window. I closed the heavy wooden door, turning the deadbolt until it clicked. I didn't feel a sudden rush of victory. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief. The heavy fog of obligation had finally lifted. I went to the kitchen and poured the rest of my coffee. From the kitchen window, I quietly watched them load the boxes into the back of the rental SUV. Sarah didn't lift a single finger to help. She stood at the end of the driveway, loudly talking on her cell phone, making sure I could hear snippets of her victim narrative through the glass. David worked in complete silence. He carried box after box out of the garage, his face pale and drawn. He looked much older than his 32 years. 2 years of trying to please a demanding wife by taking advantage of a quiet mother had finally worn him down to the bone. About an hour later, the garage was mostly empty. There was a tentative knock at the side entrance. I walked over and opened the door, deliberately leaving the thick metal security chain in place. David stood there, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. We're packed, he said softly. I left the garage door open for you. Thank you. He hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Mom, I never meant for it to get this bad. I really didn't. I just didn't want to fight with Sarah every single day. Avoiding a fight isn't the same as doing the right thing, David, I told him, keeping my voice steady. You let her disrespect me in my own home because it was easier for you. He looked down at his boots, a heavy sigh escaping his chest. I know. I'm sorry. Apologies are just words, I replied firmly. I need to see actions. Start by paying for the rental SUV you put on my card. He nodded slowly. I'll transfer the money today from my personal checking account. We're going to stay at a friend's place in the city until we can find a short-term lease. Good luck, I said. It wasn't sarcastic. I genuinely hoped he figured out how to be an independent adult. I started to close the door. Mom, he asked, looking up suddenly. Are we ever going to be okay? That depends entirely on the choices you make from here on out, I answered. And I shut the door. I walked back to the living room and watched from the bay window as they prepared to leave. Sarah got into the passenger seat of the SUV and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Her parents backed their sedan out of the driveway first, speeding off down the street without a backward glance. David stood outside the driver's door for a long moment. He looked back at the house, his eyes scanning the brickwork and the front porch. I didn't step into the window frame to wave. I just observed from the shadows. I wondered if he was finally realizing the true cost of his passivity. When you let someone else drive your life, you can't complain when they drive it straight off a cliff. He finally got into the car and started the engine. The heavy SUV reversed out of my driveway, pulling onto the street and driving away until it disappeared around the corner. The silence that fell over the property was immediate and absolutely beautiful. I walked through the house, turning on lights as I went. I went down the stairs to the lower level. It was completely empty. The lingering smell of Sarah's cloying, expensive perfume was already beginning to fade. I opened the basement windows to let the crisp winter air circulate through the rooms. I didn't sit down on the stairs and cry over the fracture of my family. The fracture had happened years ago. Today was simply the day I finally stopped trying to bandage it with my wallet. I walked back upstairs to my office and sat at my desk. My phone buzzed brightly on the wood surface. It was a notification from my bank. A transfer of exactly $1,200 had just cleared from David's account. He kept his word. It was a small step, but a highly necessary one. I typed a brief text message, "Payment received. Thank you." I didn't add an emoji or a promise to call later. The boundary was set. A week passed. The house felt entirely different. It felt like mine again. I brought my vintage antique chairs back into the dining room, arranging them exactly how I liked. I filled the refrigerator with the foods I actually enjoyed eating. I didn't have to tiptoe down my own hallway in the mornings or hide in my bedroom to avoid Sarah's daily complaints about the neighborhood. I hadn't heard a single word from Sarah, and I certainly didn't expect to. David texted me once to give me their new apartment address and to mention he was picking up extra weekend shifts to cover their new rent. I replied with a simple, "Understood." I wasn't going to punish him forever, but I absolutely was not going to rescue him anymore either. If he wanted a relationship with his mother, he would have to build it on mutual respect, not financial convenience. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat on my back patio with a fresh cup of coffee. The morning sun was warm and the neighborhood was perfectly still. I thought about the $500 I had gotten back from the canceled resort trip. It was sitting comfortably in my savings account. I decided I was going to use it. Not on a family vacation, not on a down payment to help David out of his mess, but on myself. I opened my tablet and started browsing small guided architectural tours of Italy. Just a single ticket. Just for me. I took a slow sip of my coffee, smiling at the quiet breeze rustling through my garden. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop letting them use you as a stepping stone. And the absolute best thing you can do for yourself is to finally lock the door, keep the key, and reclaim your own life.